Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ross Melzer, EU Affairs Director at the Policy Media Euractiv, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest edition of the Corteva Media Club. In this morning's session, we're going to present the recent launch, it was actually launched a couple of days ago, of the Global Food Security Index. The index, developed by Economist Impact and sponsored by Corteva Agri-Science, considers the core issues of food availability, affordability, quality, and safety. The index incorporates 113 developing and developed countries and measures almost 60 unique indicators of food security. The index has become an invaluable tool serving as an important benchmark for policymakers. And it, of course, has a particular relevance this year, a year where we've seen extreme disruption caused by the global COVID pandemic and also increased environmental disasters and climate issues. So the question of how to achieve food security and a balanced relationship between the environment, farmers, and consumers is more important than ever. Before we dive into the index, I'd like to introduce our four speakers this morning. Firstly, from Economist Impact, we have Pratima Singh, who is Senior Manager, Policy and Insights. Representing European farmers, we have Bruno Men, who is a Policy Advisor at Copper Kajeka. To give us a view from Africa, we have Ruramiso Mashumba. Ruramiso is a farmer from Zimbabwe and was actually a winner of the GFN Gleckner Award in 2020. And finally, representing industry, we have Andreas Huber, who is Integrated Field Sciences Leader, EMEA at Corteva Agri-Science. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function, and we will take as many of those questions as possible, probably more towards the end of today's webinar. Before handing over to Pratima, I want to make you aware of the interpreter function we have today for anyone who is more comfortable listening to the discussion in German. Those guests should switch now to the German channel using the drop-down menu that opens when you click on the interpretation button, and you can find that button on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom page. So without further ado, I hand over to Pratima to take us through the index's highlights. Pratima.
Thank you very much, Ross, and hello, good morning to everyone joining us today. My name is Pratima Singh, and as Ross mentioned, I'm Senior Manager and Lead for the Global Food Security Index at Economist Impact. If you could go to the next slide, please, Laura. The next page, please. So I want to start with giving you a very high-level overview of what the index is and take you through some key highlights and findings today. Well, as Ross mentioned, the Global Food Security Index, or GFSI as we call it, is an index that we use and that measures food security across 113 countries and using 58 indicators. We started this index in 2012, which is supported by Corteva Agri-Science, and we have only grown since then. We started with 105 countries and now at 113. As we mentioned as well, the index has sort of become preeminent in how it allows countries to use best practices, benchmark themselves, and really enable a dialogue on food security, something that is very critical this year, but has been for a while now. We started this index in 2012, and so this is the 10th year of the Food Security Index, and I will take you through some interesting trends that we have seen conducting this study every year for 10 years. If we could go to the next page, please, Laura. So as mentioned before, we use a framework that allows us to measure the enabling environment for food security in 113 countries. And what I mean by that is we're looking at the key drivers of food security. This includes affordability, availability, quality and safety, and the natural resource and resilience environment in these countries so that we're able to get a holistic understanding of food security going forward. If we could move to the next slide, please, 2 slides down, I want to kind of highlight some of those trends. One for this year, so between 2020 and 2021, and then also over the past 10 years. On your screen on the left side, you will see the average global food security environment scores for 113 countries. Essentially, what this means is we've aggregated the scores for our countries, and this is the overall score, starting in 2012 all the way through to 2021. It's very interesting to see this trend and the patterns that emerge in the data, because as you can see, from 2012 through to 2019, every year we saw a bit of an increase in the food security environment. From 57.2 to 61.6 in terms of the average score. However, in the past 2 years, so 2020 and 2021, we've seen a marginal decline in countries' overall food environment. And so this is a concerning trend, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's driving that. But it's important to note that there's a bit of a decline in the past 2 years. Overall, this year, we've seen that more high-income countries, so there's a very strong correlation between high income / high HDI or highly developed countries, and also the food security index, of course. Europe is leading the index in the sense that majority of the countries, so 7 out of 10 are European countries in the top 10. And conversely, sub-Saharan African countries continue to sort of dominate the bottom ranks of the index, with SSA having about 7 out of 10 of those places. If we can move to the next slide, please. What were the key findings in the 2021 index at a category level? So I'll highlight here how the individual categories have performed, starting with, of course, affordability. This is a category where we've seen that scores improved generally between 2012 and 2016. However, in the last few years, we've seen scores decline. And this is important to note because we've seen a very strong correlation between this category and other categories around measure or outcome measurements such as hunger and stunting among children. So it's an important point to monitor going forward. The second category that I want to draw your attention to is the 4th category of natural resources and resilience. What is very clear as soon as you look at this visual is that out of the 4 categories, this is the least scoring category. The average is 50.8, which is 10 points lower than our average of the overall food security environment. So what we can see here really is that this is the main category that is pulling scores down for all countries. And so there has to be tremendous improvement in this category going forward. A couple of points on the other 2 categories. Availability continues to be about average. We see this as the 3rd best performing category, just above natural resources, whereas the best performing category remains quality and safety with 68-point score on average. And this is good because, of course, we know that quality and safety ties in quite well with indicators around micronutrient availability and dietary diversity. If we could move to the next page, please. All right, one final thought on what we've learned in the overall environment before I quickly take you through high-level findings for Europe. You'll see on the left side, as I mentioned earlier, that countries that have high incomes tend to do well. High-income countries are scoring higher on average, while lower income do remain at the bottom here, and highlighted by the green, the lowest bar. What's important to note, of course, is that generally what we've seen is most countries across all income groups have in fact declined in terms of their overall food security environment in the past 2 years, which is why we've seen that overall dip. So it's important that this reversal happen at all levels. Countries that have made significant improvements over the 10 years that we've been looking are countries like China, Kenya, Cambodia, as well as some countries in the Middle East, the UAE, Algeria, and Pakistan, that have made significant improvements in the first 2 categories, where it means that they've been driving food costs down, improving food safety nets in order to make large gains. Few countries have also improved sufficiency of supply, which is measuring adequate caloric intake, as well as managing the volatility in ag production. The final thing I'll mention is in that high income category, I did highlight that these countries are also slowing in terms of progress. But one area that we've seen needs a lot of, attention is a decline in public investment, which has sort of declined across the board, but generally the decline in high income countries is much more significant. If we can move 2 slides, please, Laura, to the Europe findings. I'd like to give a quick overview of what we see in the region. The first thing to highlight is, as I mentioned, Europe does quite well on average. We see 75 points, which is above the 60 points that we've seen for 113 countries. When we break it down by category, again, we see affordability is the primary driver of this high income of Europe's good, performance. And then you see quality and safety coming up close second. But again, as we've seen in all regions, natural resources remains the category that needs significant work. In this situation, in Europe in particular, you'll see the difference between natural resources and the overall food environment is about 15 points. And so we know that there is a lot more room to grow even in this region. Ireland remains the top scorer in Europe, but also globally, scoring 84 points, and it scores above 75, in some cases above 92 in different categories. If we could move to the next page, please. Over time, we've seen that some rising stars like Russia, Bulgaria, and Belarus, of course, they are growing from a small base, but they've continued to make improvements in their environment by committing to food availability, such as managing stable production and improving access and policy commitments to food security. Whereas we've seen in some other countries that volatility in agricultural production has been the primary driver of some of the decline in scores. And so overall, we've seen generally countries have made significant improvements in their overall scores with a focus on improving affordability, whereas there still remains to be growth and improvements in the 3 other categories around availability, quality and safety, and natural resources in this region. The last and closing slide that I'd like to draw your attention to, please, is something that Ross also mentioned in terms of the impact of COVID and what's happening in the recent years. So here you'll see we've highlighted 3 key issues that Europe needs to be focused on going forward, starting with, of course, the impact of COVID, which has affected affordability in recent years. And that's basically resulted in, higher food prices in some countries, while also in decreasing or increasing inequality adjusted income levels. And so that has created a bit of a double whammy. However, we have seen some improvements in some countries to be able to offset some of this. Climate change and sustainability remains an issue that's sort of a focus area for most regions. We do see volatility in agricultural production that needs to be honed across most of the countries in Europe. And then finally, tech and innovation. I mentioned that public investment in ag can be optimized in this region as well. And there is a lot of sort of infrastructure that's foundational that will allow for this to happen. It's important that we kind of prioritize this going forward to really make significant strides in food security. With that, I'll pause and hand over to you, Ross.
Fatima, thank you very much for that excellent overview. There are multiple ways, of course, to measure food security and food insecurity. Now, you've been clear about the definition used in this index, but does that differ from other definitions? In other words, are we all using the same terminology here?
Yes, so that's a really good question. And I've highlighted the definition sort of using the categories of the index. But I guess what I'll also refer to quickly is a technical definition that was used as the foundation for this index in defining these frameworks and these pillars as well. So essentially, the 1996 World Food Summit defined food security as the state in which all people at all times have access across both, of course, the developing and developed world, have at all times physical, social, and economic access to sufficient and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs for a healthy and active life based on this definition. And so you'll see that reflected in our pillars as well when it comes to economic, so affordability, of course, physical, social, that's all reflected in the availability category, because we're kind of highlighting that, of course, you have to have sufficient food, but you also need to be able to access that food that's available. And so things like policy commitments, inequality levels, political and social barriers, as well as agricultural infrastructure, all of those are included in the second category of availability. Of course, nutritious food means quality and safety. And what we've had incorporated is the fact that there is an additional risk of climate and natural resources that also needs to be incorporated here.
Mm. Okay, no, thanks for clarifying the definitions there. And just a question on the basic methodology in ranking countries. Now, you've explained the methodology very well, but for a meaningful comparison with former years, I assume the methodology for the 2021 index was very similar. But we're talking about an extraordinary year here where there was a global pandemic. And I'm just wondering if the methodology may have been even further adapted to take COVID into account.
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. What we need to do for us to be able to look at year-on-year and even time series progress is we need to make sure that our framework is comparable over the years. So we do have the consistent framework, but what we do is every year when we are, I guess, strengthening the analysis and framework, we make sure we backdate all the scores to enable comparison. So last year, to your point on COVID, and even this year, every year we take a deep look at our framework to make sure that it is reflecting what's happening on the ground, but also is the strongest and most representative way to measure food security. And so with that in mind, last year, we incorporated several inequality-linked metrics into this index. So we know for a fact that COVID has exacerbated existing inequalities, structural inequalities like income inequality, gender inequality. And so we made sure we incorporated those metrics into the index under the appropriate category. We also wanted to make sure that we have a really good sort of current framework in place. And so the first three categories that you've seen of affordability, availability, and quality and safety have been in the index for the whole time. But last year, what we did is we incorporated the fourth category of climate risk and resilience as part of the main index, because we thought it was crucial to make sure that those two ideas are not disconnected. And so by having both of them together, we feel that we're bringing in two concepts that are inextricably linked into the conversation together. And so that's another big change we made last year. Of course, that is just a general change that we thought was overdue in order to make sure that the index is representing our biggest challenges.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. You also mentioned, Pratima, that the Global Food Security Index is now in its 10th year, and you talked about some of the new trends and challenges that have emerged over the past couple of years. But looking ahead, what will we need to pay particular attention to in the coming years? And in answering that question, perhaps you could comment specifically on this year's index showing that global food security is actually declining, despite our growing ability to produce a greater volume of food.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the richness of this data that we're able to look at some of those trends. To your point around COVID, one of the biggest reasons that we've seen this decline in the past 2 years is because of a decline in affordability on average, right? And so the pandemic has really exacerbated those risks. We've seen incomes reducing and food prices increasing in some countries. And therefore, it's important to make sure that that focus on providing basic or effective, well-targeted, transparent food safety nets remains a focus going forward so that populations can bear the risk of economic shocks. The other more long-term sort of, I guess, trend that I would highlight in terms of a focus is I guess, agricultural R&D and focus on, really bringing together both public investment as well as private expertise in defining and in promoting food security going forward. We've seen a lot of volatility in agricultural production in these past few years. And so making sure that that climate risk element, managing resources better, investing in technology to your point, make more from every single acre of land where we're producing food, and do this in a sustainable fashion is where we need to focus in order to improve this or reverse this trend going forward.
Okay, let's look at one of Europe's biggest food producers and indeed consumers, which is Germany, of course. If you were to pinpoint one major change or development in this year's index that we need to be conscious of in that country, what would that be?
Yeah, so having a look at the GFSI model and looking at the Germany in particular, how the country has performed, of course, we've seen improvements over the 10 years. But when I look at these past few years, there are a couple of things that can be improved, of course, and I'll keep it to one, and that's really looking at the sub-indicators under availability. What we've seen in Germany and where we can focus again is very much aligned with what we are recommending or suggesting high-income countries focus on, and that is on improvements in ag R&D. We've seen a bit of a decline in Germany in that particular indicator between 2020 and 2021. The other, and this is also linked, is volatility of ag production. Both of these, if we're able to invest effectively in these spaces, we're able to minimize ag volatility and ensure that there is predictable food, which would help minimize food loss and all of the other issues that we see in some of the high-income countries as well.
Okay. You've talked about food affordability, and I'd like to come back to you on that, because in the index this year, Europe performs well in terms of food affordability. But that did surprise me, knowing that in certain countries, notably the UK, we've recently seen empty supermarket shelves and food and fuel shortages. All this surely is going to result sooner or later in a rise in food prices, making them less affordable. So I'm just trying to understand how you explain this high affordability figure for Europe in this year's index.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll explain it in more detail, but I will caveat one thing, which is the data for this index is, of course, collected prior to when we publish it. So in this year, we collected it between May and July 2021. And so, of course, not all of the data is including, say, inflation or food price rises from this month. And you're absolutely right, we are seeing that take effect. But even last year, even over the past 12 months, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at trends in the past, so annual improvements or declines in food costs. So we look at that over 12 months rather than looking at it as one-off, because of course there will always be shocks. And so when we see the trend line, of course, we see it's relatively more contained. And the other reason for this is because Europe generally are the 26 out of the 113 relative to the countries that are lower income or countries in other regions. It's all relative. So compared to that, because it's sort of looking at it at a scale, we do see Europe do better than some of the other regions where we've seen more conflict, combined with obviously lockdowns, supply chain bottlenecks, and food price increases that affect affordability.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Pratima, for the time being. We will come back to you with some further questions, but I'd like now to turn to Bruno Mend. Bruno is going to start with a brief statement on the EU's farm-to-fork strategy and the role it plays in European food security. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ross. A pleasure to be here this morning with you. So as we have seen now with Pratima, the food security is still a real question nowadays. And although in Europe we have quite a nice score, and it seems we have a very good situation, we have seen with the crisis of COVID-19 that it's not given. And even now with the Brexit and what you just mentioned, Rose, about the empty shelves in UK. So when it comes to the Farm to Fork initiative, there is something that we should ask ourselves before going any further. So basically, as you know, this initiative was presented by the Commission a bit more than 1 year ago in May 2020. And the main goal of this policy is to ensure that the food production in Europe becomes more sustainable. And I believe that now no one can deny that that it's actually a goal that we all need to achieve. And the farmers are the first to be impacted by climate change, so they really know what they are talking about. And so we believe that this policy should be supported as strongly as possible. However, and this is where it becomes interesting, currently, when in the proposal by the Commission, there are some important targets, reduction targets mainly. For example, reduction the use of pesticides by 50% by 2030, reduction of nutrient losses by 50%, reduction of the use of fertilizers, increase the organic land, the agricultural land for organic up to 25%, and so on. And what's the fact is that all those targets have been set, but with no impact assessment, they are not based on scientific assessment, scientific data. And so what we are afraid now, it's that those targets, because they have not been carefully assessed, because they are not supported with a thorough plan, with new technologies, with financial support, we are afraid that they could have a huge impact on EU agriculture. And usually the Commission proceeds to a careful impact assessment when they propose such a policy. But at the moment, the Commission did not. However, many studies, although incomplete but still very interesting, have been published on the possible impact of the farm to fork targets. And what we can see, it's that those targets, if they are not clearly supported by strong policies, focusing on new technologies, on financials, means for farmers, we could end up with a new agriculture that's produce much less, with farmers' income that are being reduced, but also, and what that is very interesting, is that among the few studies that have been conducted on the possible impact of those targets, one from the USDA is actually showing that these targets could lead in Europe to 22 million additional people in food insecurity. So there is the link with food insecurity, and as you can see, that's something that is not negligible. And although in Europe right now we are in a good situation from that sense, that point of view, we need to be very careful. In addition, the other studies, like the one from the GRC, the one from Wageningen, the one from Kiel University, they do not focus directly on food insecurity, but they all show a huge reduction of production in Europe. Like, for example, for the GRC, we are talking between 5 and 15%, depending on the type of food. For Wageningen, we are talking between 10 and 20%. For Kiel University, it's an average of 16%. But also, we were just mentioning earlier food affordability. So it's not just about the production, if you have enough food for everyone, but also if everyone can afford, can pay for it. And there, the study from the Kiel University is very interesting, because basically they say that most of the burden of the price increase that will result from the loss of production will be bared by the consumers. And they predict that it's going to be around 160 euros per capita per year. So, for example, for a family of 4 people, it would be more than 640 euros a year, which is clearly not negligible when you have a low income. So what I would like to conclude on is we need to move forward. We need to support the farm to fork strategy because there is no choice. Climate change is there, biodiversity loss is there, and we need to ensure that our food production is more sustainable. But we need to be very careful about first setting targets that make sense and that are based on a scientific impact assessment. And secondly, to ensure that we have the means, both from a technological point of view and financial point of view, information point of view, to ensure that the loss of production will not be too bad, and that also the affordability of food will be maintained in Europe.
Okay, Bruno, thank you very much for that initial overview. I was actually going to ask you a question about the potential impact of the reduction targets set by Farm to Fork on European farmers, but I think you've been very clear about how these targets may affect farmers. So just a more general question on Farm to Fork. It will inevitably take time to reap rewards and to show results, and it's still very early days. But do you think we're on the right track in Europe to improve food security? And what could policymakers be doing differently or better in your view?
From our point of view, and in light of all those studies, I would say we are not on the right track to improve food security in Europe, because basically currently with the targets that are set at this moment in the Farm to Fork, if we decide to implement them, clearly this will have an impact on food security in Europe and on food affordability. So what I would say is that we need to revise the targets to make sure that they will not affect too much food production in Europe and thus food security. But also what we forget, because it's true that the EU is one of the biggest importer, actually the biggest importer of food agricultural products. But so people say, yeah, but we will have enough food in Europe. True, we will have enough food in Europe, but all that we are producing and that we won't produce anymore, somebody will need it somewhere else in third countries. And also when you have less to sell, that means also price increase. And then we are back with this problem of food affordability in Europe. So I would say make sure that those targets are based on an impact assessment, and make sure that the farmers have the tools to cope with those targets. You want to cut pesticides, that's a possibility, but then you need to provide tools to compensate.
Okay, so let me take a question from the Q&A. Veronique Schmidt asks, what is the take-up and impact of the index across the food agri chain? How does this generate action? So she's very much interested in action on the ground, back to farmers. How would you respond to that, Bruno?
So I'm not sure I'm perfectly understanding the question. Are you saying, so, okay, the food index, what do farmers react to this?
Yes, what is some concrete actions that farmers could take away from this?
Basically, farmers are just trying to do the job. So basically, they try to produce as much as they have been producing so far, while respecting EU legislation. And of course, when you see plant protection products that are being taken off of the market, or that you have to reduce the amount of fertilizer, this makes their life harder. So they are trying to find new solutions, and this can be made through different processes. For example, it's not about crops that I'm thinking right now, but about livestock. They are trying to improve the digestibility of the feed through feed additive to better combination of feed materials. So every day they're trying to find new solutions, but it's not easy, and more and very often also they do not have an easy access to the financial means that that would allow that.
Okay, another question from the audience. Bill Vietz from Consumer Choice Center. He asks you, Bruno, how do you respond to the comments of Frans Timmermans in May 2020, saying in the European Parliament that we've gotten used to food being too cheap?
I would say it depends what type of consumer is talking. It's true that, for example, when you look at some price of agricultural goods, the food is too cheap, and actually the primary producer doesn't get a fair percentage of the price paid by the consumer, or the price is simply too low. But what Mr. Timmermans is forgetting, it's that we live in a globalized world. So if you do not have a big production in Europe, you cannot compete with products from third countries. And for example, if you have your European steak at 15 euros a kilo, but next to it you have the one from Argentina at 10 euros, it's gonna be an issue for the EU farmers.
Yeah. Okay. Let's stay with EU policymakers for the time being, and we increasingly hear talk about sovereignty, digital sovereignty, food sovereignty. Now, this, of course, is the notion that Europe should not be overly reliant on food imports. What can be done, in your view, to make Europe more self-sufficient in terms of food production?
We need to continue to have a strong agriculture. Right now, we have one, if not the most efficient agriculture in the world. We are one of the biggest producer, and as I said, we are the biggest world exporter. But we are still relying on many products coming from third countries, and that's normal. We live in a globalized world. We shouldn't aim to be completely independent, but it's very important that that we remain at least to a certain extent self-sufficient and not too dependent on specific countries. How can we improve that further? I would change the question. I would say, how could we at least maintain the current situation? And for this, I mean, I'm sorry because I'm going to repeat myself, but we need to ensure that we maintain a strong EU agriculture, and that, yes, we need to go to more sustainable food production, but this shouldn't be at the cost of our food sovereignty. Thank you.
Okay, look, a final quick question, Bruno, again from the audience, from Emre Akyuts. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. He asks, are there any reflections from farmers about farm to fork? Do you have any studies measuring their knowledge about farm to fork or their approach to farm to fork?
To be honest, farmers are very worried about the farm to fork because they are already in a very difficult situation. I mean, their margin are very, very low. Their access to finance is very difficult because of those very low margin. And for example, in France, the average income for farmers net per month is less than 1,300 euros. Mm-hmm. So based on that, when they see that they will have further constraints, that they will have additional requirements to respect, and that those requirements will impact their income, let me tell you, they are extremely worried. To be honest, some are very angry because what the feeling they have, it's that they have been over the years working at making their food production more sustainable, and this is this can clearly be seen, for example, with the reduction of the use of pesticide, because we are talking about this 50% reduction, but we have already reduced quite a lot, and we continue to reduce because our techniques are improving, and with precision farming, you can use less and less. For antimicrobials, it's the same. For example, in Italy, the poultry sector managed to reduce the use of antimicrobials by more than 80%, 1-0, over the past 10 years. But it's taking time and it's taking means. And right now we have a CAP that has a lower budget than before, so less money for farmers, but we are asking them to produce the same with higher production costs because of more sustainability. And so they're committed to that because, as I said, they're the first one impacted by climate change. I mean, we have seen it with the floods in Belgium and Germany and the Eastern France this summer that impacted actually the production quite a lot. So they are committed to that, but it's not going to be easy.
Okay, well, look, Bruno, thank you for the time being. We're now going to turn to Ruamiso Mashumba, who is a smallholder farmer from Zimbabwe. Ruamiso, welcome again. I'd like to start by asking you, what's your experience with the development of food security over the past 10 years in your country, Zimbabwe? And of the 4 pillars outlined in the index, affordability, availability, quality and safety, natural resources and resilience, what are the most important or relevant in your country?
Thank you very much for that question. You know, as you were mentioning the different important fundamentals of agriculture, you know, one would think that all of them are important, but I come from a country where availability of food is actually, I would consider, the most important due to multiple factors that we have faced in Zimbabwe. As a country, we need to ensure that we actually have the food available for people to eat. A few years ago, we actually had an experience because of the hectic droughts that were happening. Our production of maize had really dropped, and maize is our staple crop, and our staple food, as well as processing of a lot of goods, including our animal feed. Because of the droughts, people in Zimbabwe were actually not able to have enough food, and they had to have emergency aid coming in from the US to be able to feed people. So availability is the most important to Zimbabwe.
Okay, we've talked already about climate challenges. So let's look specifically at climate challenges for smallholder farmers in your country. Now, we know that sub-Saharan Africa is particularly vulnerable to climate change and its impact on food security. So day to day, in managing your smallholder farm, what are the main climate-related challenges you face?
For drought, the amount of rain that's been falling each year is now less and less. We actually have challenges of irrigating our crops. I'm fortunate enough that I actually grow wheat, which is the same as the background. And you'd find that the amount of water that is required to grow crops is actually quite high. And because of climate change, we haven't had frequent rains. We have a lot of dry spells. So a lot of the dam levels are already low, and we only have one season. So one of the experiences that I've seen as a farmer is the huge challenge of just not enough water, lots of droughts. So the demand of food is increasing, but thinking of how then can we farm in a more sustainable way, increasing our yields, but also using the limited resources that are available.
So that would suggest, Lisa, that it's important to build resilience in the face of these climate change-related vulnerabilities. So, what are the practical improvements that are needed? What is your government doing, or other African governments doing to build resilience?
So one of the things that, that's been promoted in Zimbabwe, and I would say a greater part of Africa, is conservation agriculture. In Zimbabwe, last year, our government rolled out what they call Fumfudza. So Fumfudza is basically climate smart agriculture. So they looked at climate smart as an opportunity for farmers to farm better and to be more resilient to climate change. But you see a lot of practices of climate smart agriculture, when we're talking about zero-till in developed world, they use a lot of equipment to be able to achieve this. And yet in Zimbabwe, we've got a lot of smallholder farmers, which are maybe on 1 hectare piece of land and are unable to afford these equipment, which can achieve the climate methods of farming. So what our government did is that they taught farmers how to practice climate smart on a very small piece of land, which they call Fumfudza. So farmers are learning how to practice zero to minimum till, mulching their soils, digging small dams so that they can save water instead of the water just running off as surface runoff. So there are quite a few initiatives that are being rolled out. Also looking at the type of seed varieties that we grow in Zimbabwe and ensuring that we are revisiting and seeing that are these seed varieties ideal for the climate. So we now need more short season varieties. And so there's a lot of promotion of that that's currently happening in the country because it's seen as very urgent, the need for the country to be climate resilient, the need for farmers to be able to produce food, because again, like I said, availability of food is by far the most important. We can't have people dying of hunger. We need to ensure that people have food, and that as a country, we are food secure.
Okay, you've just mentioned smart agriculture there, and there seems a lot more potential for the adoption of innovative and digital agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. But we also hear that infrastructure, investment, knowledge gaps need to be filled first. So where have you seen improvements, and what more needs to be done in this area of smart and innovative agriculture?
Well, I would like to share on what I'll consider one of the most innovative tools that are available in Zimbabwe and a lot of Africa is mobile money. So long time ago, you would have to, if you wanted to make a payment, you actually needed to pay cash, or if you wanted to send money to another community, you had to travel with that money. But in Zimbabwe, we have the adaptation of mobile money is very, very high. We actually have a platform called EcoCash, and the interesting thing is even people who are not very literate are able to use EcoCash, and most people have this platform. So I'd say in terms of digital technology, this is one of the ones which I would commend and say it's really done well in terms of access to banking for the minority. And also for the very poor, because you don't need to have a smartphone to use it. You can just use any ordinary phone, and you just dial a certain number, and then you're able to transact. You're able to live a normal life. So definitely, I would say the digital era is something that's very important to Africa. And looking at, even though without infrastructure like smartphones or Wi-Fi, other tools that are available that farmers can use and help the economy.
Okay. Final question on EU Africa. So the Commission President named EU Africa relations as a priority of her tenure. Now, have you, as an African farmer, seen any impact of EU policies on African farmers and growers? Or is the EU just some kind of vague concept that doesn't impact your day-to-day work? And if that is the case, what should the EU be doing to help African farmers?
Well, as a farmer myself, what I've seen is that the increase in ability to grow crops to export into the EU, that sort of opportunity has really increased. So I think that there is a lot that's happening. And as a farmer myself, I've seen also opportunities even for smallholder farmers to start growing crops to export into the EU. So this is an opportunity that I would say that I commend and other ways to work together with the EU to really help ensure food, that farmers have better markets to sell some of their horticulture crops and increase income in the country. So I think it's a positive step in the right direction.
Okay, well, that's a nice optimistic note to end on, Rurimi. So thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to Andreas Huber. Andreas, can you firstly, briefly describe what's your definition of sustainable food production, and what do you emphasize when talking about sustainable food production?
Yes, thanks a lot for the question. Well, first of all, we need to consider that plants and food crops need a lot of resources to grow. So nutrients, good soil structure, water, beneficial insects. So in other words, they need a healthy ecosystem to grow and deliver the food that we eat. So if we ensure that these natural resources, and here I'm speaking not only about the field, but also the surrounding ecosystem, are not depleted over time, so that we can grow food on the same land for many generations, and we don't have to expand further agricultural production into natural habitats, then I think we can speak of sustainable food production. We also need to consider that these conditions are becoming more volatile, as we have also seen now in the Food Security Index. That means local production needs to adapt to these volatile or new conditions. And I think this is a key priority for agricultural research now. So how can we ensure that we can produce enough food on the land that we have, without and maintaining a healthy ecosystem, which is basically the basis of this production. Despite the fact that we have now more rainfall or less rainfall in certain areas, shorter or longer growing seasons, or new diseases and new pests that are important stressors to these plants. I think these are the key priorities for research today.
Okay, let me ask you about the environmental impact of food production. And we all recognize that global food production methods must change or improve to minimize the impact on the environment and support the world's capacity to produce more food in the future. What changes are needed so that food production contributes less to climate change, less to water scarcity, less to soil degradation, and the loss of biodiversity? I mean, what's your company doing to help mitigate the impact on the environment?
Yes, I think the largest environmental impact of agriculture is the fact to convert natural land into arable land. And we need to stop this trend at a global level. So we need to make sure that food is produced on the existing arable land that we have around the world, and that we don't move further into these biodiversity reserves that are left in the world. So we need to deal with these environmental stressors that push farmers to go into natural land, like drought or excessive rainfall or new pests or diseases. So what can we do on the existing agricultural land to reduce the environmental footprint? I think one key lever, very important lever also for European agriculture, is the crop rotation. A lot of crop rotations are certainly not ideal, because they are so if you introduce more healthy crops, crops that improve the environmental footprint, this is often very risky for the farmer. It's economically not viable, or very often, for the farmer. So we need to work on such crops to make these production systems more profitable, more viable for the grower, and introduce rotational partners that improve the environmental impact. I'm just thinking here, for example, about soybeans, who could be a very good rotational partner also for European farmers. But these crops first need to be adapted and optimized to European climate conditions. Also, oilseed rape is an important protein crop that I want to mention here.
Okay, you're starting to talk a little bit about farming practices here. So what farming practices can safeguard land and water and energy resources, wetland and forest areas? Is there a role for fertilizers and pesticides? What role can they play here?
Yes, they certainly play an important role, but we need to ensure to reduce the emissions from agricultural fields. This is absolutely essential to protect the soils, but also the water resources. So, for example, winter crops are essential. We need to have winter crops that can be grown, even in regions where you have a lack of rainfall, where you have a lack of water that don't sustain winter crops normally, but we can produce crops that can deal with this water shortage. Nitrogen is absolutely essential for crops, but an excess of nitrogen can lead to groundwater issues and emissions into the atmosphere. So we need to slow down the conversion of nitrogen in soil to keep it as long as possible in the root zone. And here we have nitrogen stabilizers that can do this. And so to keep it in the root zone that is taken up by the plants and not lost to groundwater or to the atmosphere as greenhouse gas. And then I want to mention crop protection. It's absolutely essential to protect crops against diseases and pests. But we need to certainly always strive for a reduction of volumes that are put out into the environment. So new sensor-assisted application systems are leading to a dramatic reduction of pesticide volumes that are applied, because you really apply only to the weed and only to the leaf with the disease on it, and you can reduce dramatically the volume and also the loss into non-target habitats through these methods. So we continuously need to work on these areas to reduce the environmental footprint.
Okay, Ruamiso talked about agri-tech in Africa. Now, agri-tech in Europe, of course, benefits from a couple of key factors. Firstly, the high smartphone penetration rates we have here. And secondly, from a strong political commitment to digitization. And it's generally recognized that further investment can help Europe optimize its potential for growth in terms of agricultural technology and innovation. Digitization is very important here. The trend is positive. But do you fear that European farmers are losing or perhaps don't have access to certain products, solutions, new technologies, because of what some would call a non-science-based regulatory approach in Europe?
Yes, I think it's a big problem for us that legislation is often not following the pace of innovation. So we have a lot of new technologies now that take much longer in Europe to reach the market, but could help us to reach, for example, climate goals and biodiversity goals. So I mentioned already digitally assisted crop protection applications. This is possible already now, but not considered yet in legislations. But also new breeding technologies that could help us to develop crops that can deal with drought or with excessive rainfall that we are seeing now over the last few years in Europe. New breeding technologies are currently regulated under the GMO legislation, simply because there is no legislation available to consider new breeding technologies. So this needs to change. I think in general, we need to come to a situation where the environmental benefit of new technology is considered, not only the risk of a technology, because if we ignore the benefit of new technologies, then this approach can become a risk in itself, because we won't be able to reach our very ambitious climate goals that we have if we simply ignore these new technologies or take too long to include them in our legislation systems.
Okay, Andreas, thank you very much for that. I'd actually like to go back to Pratima and the question that Veronique Schmidt asked in the Q&A, because she has qualified what she was specifically referring to. And Pratima, she's asking about the power of influence of the index and what capacity it has to generate action and concrete examples, and not so much for the farmers, but more for policymakers and private industry. So Pratima, what is the power of influence of the index for you?
Thanks very much, Ross, and thanks for the question, Veronique. I think that you're absolutely right. What we're trying to do is really open that dialogue and ensure that all stakeholders come together in order to resolve and achieve these goals that we've highlighted, and with a particular focus, of course, on policymakers, even NGOs, as well as private industry. And so I guess in terms of those stakeholders, the first thing I'll say is that when it comes to policymakers, we know that the GFSI is sort of a benchmarking tool, and that's become almost a key performance indicator for many governments. So we know that there are governments around the world who say we need to improve our ranking or be in the top 15 of the GFSI. And so there's a real sort of drive to improve that environment at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. And that's really one way in which this GFSI has sort of been able to drive action. The second thing I'll say is around private industry and private sectors. We know that the GFSI is used as a tool when some corporates are making decisions about where to invest. Agri-food and agrochemical companies, even investment companies, they look at the environment for investment in certain technologies, in certain, whether it's for financing and other things in certain countries. And so that's another way that corporates are using it, by looking at how the environment has evolved in different countries. And then finally, around NGOs and nonprofits, they're an important factor in being able to have this conversation and challenge existing norms. So we know that GFSI is used a lot of times when we're looking at studies around, say, women and reproductive health and how that leads to food security and the correlation thereof. So lots of work on that front in order to really drive action on these, on, I guess, the UN SDG of zero hunger.
Thank you, Pratima. That's an excellent way to round off today's discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we could have gone on for a lot longer, but we do want to respect your time. I'd like to thank our four panelists and you, the audience, for your time this morning. A recording of this session will be available on Euractiv, and you'll all receive the link to this in the coming days. Well, we didn't quite solve the issue of global food insecurity, but it is research like the Global Food Security Index and discussions like ours today that can really help move towards better policy making, as Pratima has just said, in the fight to improve global food security. I wish you all a very good day. Thank you for joining.